A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You know, Herman, I was looking at some floor plans the other day. Don't ask why. I just fell down a rabbit hole, and 60 square meters is not a lot of space. It's about 640 square feet. Now, imagine putting two adults, a growing 9-month-old named Ezra, a mountain of baby gear, and the background radiation of a literal war into that space. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that. He's looking at his son, Ezra, and his gut is telling him they aren't doing enough. No daycare, limited space, and this constant nagging intuition that a 9-month-old needs more. More novelty, more stimulation, more developmental milestones checked off a list.
It is a classic case of parental optimization, anxiety, Corn, and honestly, it's understandable. When the external world feels unstable, especially in a wartime context in Jerusalem, the urge to perfectly control the internal world, the home environment, becomes overwhelming. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 1.5 Flash. But Daniel's question is actually a profound one for developmental science. What is the minimum viable enrichment for a human being between 8 and 12 months old? We tend to view babies as these empty vessels that will stagnate if we don't constantly pour content into them. But the biological reality is much more aggressive and resilient than that.
I love that phrase. Minimum viable enrichment. It sounds like a tech startup for toddlers. But Daniel is being very clear here. He's not an Instagram dad. He's not doom-scrolling Montessori shelfies and feeling bad because he doesn't have a wooden rainbow. This is coming from his gut. He's worried that staying at home in a small apartment instead of being in a structured daycare is somehow stunting Ezra's growth. So, Herman Poppleberry, put on your researcher hat. What is actually happening in Ezra's brain right now? Because 9 months feels like a massive turning point.
It's more than a turning point. It's a total system architecture overhaul. Around the 9-month mark, babies go through what researchers often call a major developmental shift or a system update. According to 2024 research from the Max Planck Institute, there is roughly a 25% increase in synaptic density in the prefrontal cortex during this specific window. This isn't just growth, it's a fundamental reorganization of how the brain processes information. They are moving from being passive observers who react to the world to active agents who have goals. If Ezra wants a toy across the room, he doesn't just cry for it anymore, he plans a route.
A 25% increase in synaptic density? That's wild. That's like your computer suddenly getting a quad-core processor overnight while you're trying to run the same old software. No wonder they get cranky. But does that hardware upgrade require a specific input to calibrate correctly? If Daniel is sitting there in Jerusalem and the sirens go off or they're stuck inside because of the situation, is Ezra missing out on the data he needs to wire those new synapses?
That's the core misconception we need to bust. We often confuse input with entertainment. For a 9-month-old, the most stimulating thing in the universe isn't a high-tech toy or a specialized curriculum. It's the physics of a spoon falling off a high chair, or the texture of a rug, or the sound of Hannah's voice changing pitch when she talks to him. This age is dominated by 3 main pillars: gross motor development, fine motor refinement, and the explosion of receptive language. Let's look at gross motor first. The transition from crawling to cruising where they shimmy along furniture is a massive milestone. Does a baby need a gymnasium for that? No, they need a coffee table and a safe floor.
See, that's where the 60 square meter apartment actually becomes an advantage, doesn't it? In a massive house, a baby might just get stranded in the middle of a giant rug. In a small apartment, everything is a handhold. The couch, the bookshelf, the radiator. It's basically a built-in jungle gym. But Daniel's worry about novelty is interesting. How much new stuff does a brain with 25% more synapses actually need? Does he need to be seeing new faces and new parks every day to avoid boring his brain into stagnation?
Actually, the research suggests the opposite for this age group. A 2023 study from the University of Washington tracked 200 infants in wildly different home environments, some high resource, some very minimal. They found that floor time quality, the amount of time a baby is allowed to move freely without being strapped into a seat or a container, mattered significantly more for motor development than the variety of toys or the size of the room. In fact, too much novelty can lead to sensory noise. At 9 months, repetition is how they debug their new hardware. They drop the spoon 50 times not because they're bored, but because they are conducting a physics experiment on gravity and parental patience.
I've seen that experiment. The results are consistent, the spoon falls, and the parent gets annoyed. It's a very reproducible study. But what about the social aspect? Daniel mentioned they chose to keep Ezra out of daycare until next year. There's this cultural narrative that babies need peers to socialize, or they'll become weird loners who can't share. Is there any actual science behind the babies need babies idea at 9 months? Or is that just something we tell ourselves to feel better about the high cost of childcare?
The socialization argument for infants under 12 months is almost entirely a myth, corn. From a developmental standpoint, a 9-month-old does not play with other babies. They engage in parallel play at best, but mostly they just treat other babies like interesting, slightly unpredictable moving objects. Their primary social need is what's called dyadic interaction, one-on-one engagement with a primary caregiver. According to a massive 2023 meta-analysis published in the journal Pediatrics, secure attachment to a primary caregiver is a better predictor of social competence at age 5 than any early daycare or group enrichment program. For Ezra, having Daniel and Hannah right there is the gold standard.
But wait, Herman, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If Daniel and Hannah are the only social data Ezra is getting, doesn't he miss out on the variety of human expression? Like, if he only sees two faces, is his facial recognition software getting a limited training set?
It's a fair question, but actually, the training set of 2 highly responsive, expressive parents is infinitely more valuable than 20 distracted caregivers or a dozen other crying babies. At 9 months, infants are mastering social referencing. That's when they look at a parent's face to decide if a new situation is safe. If Ezra crawls toward a new object and looks back at Daniel, Daniel's nod or smile provides a complex neurological green light. You don't get that high-fidelity feedback loop in a crowded daycare. In a small apartment, that loop is constant and reinforced.
So Daniel's gut feeling that he's not doing enough might actually be a byproduct of his own high standards, rather than Ezra's actual needs. It's like he's trying to provide a 5-star resort experience when Ezra is perfectly happy with a clean campsite and a good fire. But let's talk about the wartime context. That's the heavy part of this prompt. Living in Jerusalem right now isn't just about space, it's about the emotional climate. If the parents are stressed, which, let's be real, how could they not be? Does that stress leak into Ezra's development? Is that a form of negative enrichment?
This is where the research is actually quite heartening. There's a lot of data on resilience factors in infants during conflict zones. A series of studies on Israeli families during recent conflicts showed that the primary buffer against developmental stress for an infant isn't the absence of war, it's the responsiveness of the caregiver. Babies Ezra's age are like little emotional barometers. They don't understand the geopolitics, but they understand the tension in a hand holding them. If Daniel and Hannah can maintain sensitive caregiving, meaning they respond to his cries and provide comfort, Ezra's cortisol levels stay regulated, even if there are sirens outside. The secure base theory suggests that as long as the base feels stable, the child can process external chaos remarkably well.
That's a huge relief, honestly. It shifts the burden from, I must stop the world from being scary to, I must be a calm place in a scary world. But I want to dig into the minimum viable enrichment checklist. If we're stripping away the guilt, what are the non-negotiables? If Daniel and Hannah are in that apartment, and they're feeling like we've been inside for 3 days, he's going to be behind on his milestones, what are the 3 or 4 things they should focus on to know they're hitting the mark?
Okay, let's get technical. If I'm designing a minimum viable enrichment protocol for a 9-month-old in a small space, here's the list. First, receptive language input. At 9 months, Ezra is in a language explosion phase, but it's all internal. He's mapping phonemes and understanding words long before he can say them. The input he needs isn't the baby Einstein video, it's Daniel and Hannah narrating their day. I'm picking up the blue cup. Now I'm putting it in the sink. That serve and return interaction is the literal fuel for his linguistic brain.
I'm opening another can of tuna because that's all we have in the pantry. I'm looking at the news and sighing deeply. I guess narration is easy enough, but does the content of the narration matter? Like, if Daniel is talking about the news or his work, does Ezra benefit from that, or does it have to be baby talk?
It's actually a mix. Parentes, that high-pitched, sing-songy voice, is biologically designed to grab an infant's attention and highlight the boundaries between words. But the narrative itself matters too. A 2022 study in developmental science showed that the sheer volume of words a child hears in a social context predicts their vocabulary size at age 3. So, whether Daniel is explaining the geopolitical situation or the steps to making coffee, Ezra is absorbing the rhythm, the syntax, and the phonetics. It's all data for the language processor.
What's number 2 on the list?
Number 2 is object permanence and cognitive challenges. This is the age where they realize things still exist even when they can't see them. This is the system update I mentioned. You don't need fancy toys for this. A game of peekaboo or hiding a toy under a kitchen towel is peak cognitive development for a 9-month-old. It teaches them about the stability of the physical world. If you do that 3 times a day, you've hit the cognitive enrichment requirement. You're teaching him how to hold a mental representation of an object in his mind. That's foundational for abstract thought later in life.
It's basically Introduction to Philosophy, but with a burp cloth. I can get behind that. What about the physical stuff? Fine motor skills? I know the pincer grasp is a big deal around this age.
The pincer grasp using the thumb and forefinger is a huge neurological milestone. It requires incredible coordination between the visual cortex and the motor strip. But again, look at the minimum viable requirement. You don't need a fine motor activity board from Amazon. You need a few pieces of puffed cereal or some safe small household objects on a high chair tray. The act of trying to pick up a single pea is a high-level workout for Ezra's brain. If he's doing that during meals, he's getting the aspirational level of fine motor training.
So we've got language narration, peekaboo for cognitive mapping, and the P challenge for fine motor skills. That sounds suspiciously simple, Herman. Are you sure we're not underselling it? I feel like there's a whole industry built on telling parents that if they don't buy a specific sensory bin, their kid won't get into a good kindergarten.
That industry is built on marketing, induced anxiety, not developmental science. Let's look at the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. It's a famous, though heartbreaking, study of children in Romanian orphanages. It showed that even in environments with almost zero structured enrichment, no toys, no colorful walls, the kids who were moved into foster care with a single, dedicated, responsive parent caught up on almost every developmental marker. The variable that mattered wasn't the stuff, it was the person. The stuff is just a prop for the interaction. If Daniel is worried about Ezra's development, he should realize that he is the primary developmental toy. His face, his voice, his reactions. That's the high-fidelity input.
I'm just imagining Daniel trying to explain to his gut feeling that he is, in fact, a high-fidelity input. It's hard to internalize that when you're stuck in 60 square meters and the world feels like it's on fire. But what about novelty? Daniel mentioned he's worried about providing enough experience. Does a baby need to see a tree? Does he need to feel grass? Or is the texture of the living room rug enough sensory input for now?
At 9 months, the world is only about 6 feet in diameter around the baby. Their visual acuity is still refining, and their attention span is measured in seconds. For Ezra, the texture of a different fabric, say, moving from a cotton shirt to a wool sweater, is a novel sensory experience. We overestimate how much scale a baby needs. In a 60 square meter apartment, there are probably 20 different textures, 50 different sounds, and 1,000 different light patterns. That is more than enough data for a 9-month-old brain to process. In fact, in wartime, keeping the novelty low can actually be a protective strategy. It keeps the baseline predictable so the baby doesn't get overstimulated and stressed.
That's a really interesting point. We think of boredom as a negative, but for a baby, predictability is actually safety. If the outside world is unpredictable, the inside world being boring is actually a gift. It's a controlled environment where he can master the basics. But I want to go back to the daycare versus home care thing. Daniel and Hannah decided to keep him home. Is there any research that suggests babies who stay home in low novelty environments actually do better than daycare kids?
There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that for children under 12 months, low arousal environments like a quiet home are actually better for long-term emotional regulation. Daycares, by their nature, are high arousal. There are lots of babies, lots of noise, lots of competing needs. While that's not bad, it does put a higher demand on an infant's stress response system. A 2022 study showed that infants in home-based care often have lower baseline cortisol levels throughout the day compared to those in large group settings. If the goal is secure attachment and emotional stability, staying home with parents who are responsive is the actual elite option. Daniel isn't settling for home care, he's providing a bespoke, high-stability environment.
So Daniel is basically running a boutique, one-on-one developmental lab, and he's worried he's failing because he doesn't have a cafeteria and a playground. It's funny how our brains work. We look at what we aren't doing and assume that's the missing piece. But Herman, let's talk about the Instagram guilt, even though Daniel said he doesn't have it. I think there's a deeper version of that guilt. A cultural guilt that says a baby's potential is a finite resource that we have to unlock with the right activities. If Ezra isn't crawling by 10 months or clapping by 9 months, is that a sign that the environment is too small?
Milestones are ranges, not deadlines. And the physical environment, the 60 square meters, is almost never the limiting factor for those milestones. Unless a baby is literally kept in a crib 24 hours a day, they will find a way to move. I've seen research on verticality in small spaces. Babies in smaller apartments actually tend to cruise and stand earlier sometimes because there are more vertical surfaces close together to grab onto. It's like parkour for toddlers. As for clapping or waving, those are social imitations. If Daniel and Hannah clap when he does something cool, he'll learn to clap. He doesn't need a socialization class to learn how to be a human. He just needs 2 humans to watch.
Parkour for toddlers is a great mental image. Ezra just wall jumping off the sofa to get to a stray sock. But let's address the gut feeling Daniel has. Intuition is a powerful thing, especially for a parent. If his gut is saying he needs more, is there any chance the gut is right about something the science is missing? Like maybe variety of perspective?
I think Daniel's gut is actually sensing his own need for action. As parents, when we feel helpless, especially in a war, we want to do something. We want to buy the toy, sign up for the class, create the experience. It makes us feel like we're protecting our child from the circumstances. But the science is very clear. At 9 months, the most active thing you can do for a baby's brain is to be present and boring. It sounds counterintuitive, but boring means safe. Boring means predictable. If Daniel wants to satisfy that gut feeling, he should reframe enrichment as interaction quality. Instead of, how can I show him something new? Ask, how can I engage more deeply with what's already here?
So basically, instead of a field trip to a museum, a field trip to the back of the kitchen cabinet.
To a 9-month-old, a plastic mixing bowl and a wooden spoon are a multi-sensory masterclass. They have different weights, different temperatures, and they make completely different sounds when struck together. That is STEM education in its purest form. If Daniel puts Ezra on the kitchen floor with 3 safe household objects, he's providing more cognitive stimulation than a plastic learning center with flashing lights. The flashing lights are a closed system press button, get light. The mixing bowl is an open system. It can be a drum, a hat, a cave, or a mirror.
It's the quality over quantity argument, but backed by neuroscience. I like it. So, if we're looking at Ezra's day in Jerusalem, he wakes up, he has some milk, he plays on the floor of the living room while Daniel works nearby, or Hannah narrates the breakfast process. They play some peekaboo. He tries to eat a pea. He cruises along the edge of the coffee table. Is that enough? It feels like it's not enough for a high-achieving parent to hear.
It is more than enough. In fact, let's look at the aspirational gold standard versus the minimum viable. The aspirational version is often just the minimum viable with better lighting and more expensive wood. The gold standard for language isn't a tutor, it's a parent who talks to their baby. The gold standard for motor skills isn't a gym, it's a safe floor. The gold standard for cognitive development isn't educational apps, it's a cardboard box and a game of where did the ball go? Daniel and Hannah aren't just hitting the minimum, they are likely providing the optimum simply by being there and being responsive.
And the war? We can't just hand wave that away. It's a massive stressor. But the buffer you mentioned, the sensitive caregiving, that's the key, right? If they can manage their own stress enough to be present for Ezra, Ezra is essentially shielded from the long-term developmental impact. It's like a psychological iron dome.
That is exactly what it is. A 2024 paper in the Jerusalem Post actually interviewed social workers in Israel about this. They noted that babies' brains are like sponges. They absorb the emotional atmosphere. But the absorption works both ways. If the parents can create a microclimate of calm and warmth within those 60 square meters, the baby's brain interprets the world as safe. The biological systems of a baby are dual-tracked. They are social emotional seekers and they are physical explorers. As long as those two tracks aren't blocked by neglect or extreme environmental deprivation, which Ezra clearly isn't experiencing, they will thrive.
I think one of the most practical takeaways here is the audit of pressure. Daniel needs to audit where this not enough feeling is coming from. If it's not from Instagram, it might be from a sense of lost time or lost opportunity because of the war. But for a 9-month-old, there is no lost time. Every moment is the first time. Ezra doesn't know there's a better version of a 9-month-old's life happening somewhere in a peaceful suburbs. He only knows his life. And if his life includes parents who love him and a floor he can crawl on, he's winning.
Well said, Korn. There's a beautiful study from the University of Haifa, very relevant to their location, that looked at maternal sensitivity in the context of persistent security threats. They found that the ability of the parent to mentalize the baby, to think about what the baby is feeling and needing as a separate person, was the single greatest predictor of the child's later emotional intelligence. It wasn't about the activities they did, it was about the attunement. If Daniel is worried about Ezra's experience, the fact that he's even asking that question shows he's attuned. He's thinking about Ezra's internal world. That is the enrichment.
So, let's get practical for a second. If Daniel is listening and he's thinking, okay, I'm the primary toy, but I have to work, how does he balance that? He's in 60 square meters. He can't exactly disappear into a home office.
That's the coexistence phase. At 9 months, Ezra is starting to understand independent play, but only if he knows the secure base is nearby. Daniel doesn't need to be actively playing with Ezra for 8 hours. He just needs to be an available presence. Researchers call this passive availability. If Ezra is playing with a sock on the rug and Daniel is typing on his laptop 2 feet away, that counts as a high-quality developmental environment. Ezra explores, hits a frustration point, looks up to see Daniel is still there, and that reassurance allows him to go back to exploring. It's a rhythmic cycle of independence and connection.
So, the actionable insight number 1 for Daniel and Hannah, your presence is the curriculum. If you're talking, if you're playing, if you're responding to his system update frustrations, you're hitting the 99th percentile of developmental support. You don't need to compensate for the small apartment. The apartment is just the container, you are the content.
And number 2, embrace the boring. In a wartime situation, boring is a luxury for a baby's nervous system. Don't feel guilty that he's not seeing new parks or meeting new people. Those things are nice to haves, but the must-have is a regulated, calm caregiver. If keeping the world small helps you stay calm, then keeping the world small is the best thing you can do for Ezra.
It's a bit like that Sabbath idea, right? Creating a sanctuary in time, even if the space is small. For Ezra, every day in that apartment can be a sanctuary if the emotional climate is right. I also think the minimum viable enrichment checklist is a great way to quiet the gut feeling. Narrate the day, play, peekaboo, let him cruise the furniture, and give him something small to pick up. If you did those 4 things, you can go to bed knowing Ezra's brain grew exactly the way it was supposed to.
I'd add one more to that checklist, floor time freedom. Just let him be on the floor, unpropped, uncontained, for as much of the day as possible. Let him figure out how to navigate the canyon between the sofa and the coffee table. That struggle to move is where the synapses are firing. You don't need to help him reach a milestone. You just need to get out of the way and let the biology do its thing. Human babies have been developing in small huts, tents, and crowded spaces for 50,000 years. Our biology is designed for close quarters enrichment.
I wonder, Herman, since we're talking about small spaces, is there any fun fact about how babies in different cultures handle limited space? I remember reading something about cradle boards or babies being carried all day.
That's a fascinating tangent. In many nomadic cultures or high-density urban environments in history, babies were swaddled or carried in slings for the vast majority of the day, and guess what? They still hit their milestones. The human brain is so hungry for development that it will find data anywhere. A baby carried on a mother's back while she works is getting a constant stream of vestibular input balance data and social data from the conversation she has. Ezra, even in a small apartment, is living in a high-resource environment compared to the vast majority of human history.
Parkour Toddler in a Canyon of Furniture. That's the title of Ezra's first biography. But honestly, Herman, this makes me feel better for Daniel. It's so easy to get caught in the more is better trap, especially when you're a thoughtful, tech-literate guy who's used to optimizing systems. But a baby isn't a system you optimize from the outside. It's a system that optimizes itself as long as you provide the right environment parameters. And those parameters are surprisingly simple. Love, talk, move, repeat.
And that repeat part is key. Daniel might feel like he's stuck in a loop, but for Ezra, the loop is where the learning happens. The 1,000th time he hears the word cup is just as important as the first time. The 1,000th time he pulls himself up on that coffee table is where the muscle memory becomes permanent. Consistency is the foundation of cognitive scaling. If Daniel and Hannah can provide that consistency in the middle of a war, they are essentially giving Ezra a superpower, the ability to feel stable in an unstable world.
It's a powerful perspective shift. From we are trapped in a small space during a war, to we are providing a high stability, high attunement microenvironment for our son. It doesn't change the geopolitical reality, but it changes the developmental reality for Ezra. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. Daniel, Hannah, if you're listening, Ezra is lucky to have parents who are this worried about his experience. That worry is just love in a different form, but you can put some of that worry down. The science has your back.
It really does. There's no aspirational gold standard that beats a loving, present parent in a safe enough home. Everything else is just DLC downloadable content that's nice to have but not required for the main game to be a masterpiece. Ezra's main game is going perfectly.
Downloadable content for babies. I'm going to start calling toys cosmetic skins for the nursery. Anyway, this has been a fascinating dive into the minimum viable baby. It's a good reminder for all of us that enough is often much closer than we think, especially when we're stressed or overwhelmed.
Well, I've certainly learned that I'm a high-fidelity input, which I'm going to remind Korn of next time he tries to ignore me. Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly while we dive into these deep developmental waters.
And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power our research and this whole operation. We couldn't do these deep dives without that kind of horsepower. If you're enjoying my weird prompts, and you want to make sure you never miss an episode where we compare toddlers to quad-core processors, search for us on Telegram to get notified the second a new episode drops.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We'll be back with more of Daniel's and your deepest, weirdest questions soon.
See ya!
Goodbye.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.